So this is the woolliest of all these three, but as said, it can either come first or it can come third. It can either come first or it can come third. And it is, so you want to build an aircraft carrier. Truly? Really? Deeply? Well, operation and learning from experience. Now, I usually put this as part 3 of 3. Because the reason I put it as part 3 of 3 is technically, in the process of a nation becoming an aircraft carrier power, this, of course, is going to be the end part. It's operating your carrier and learning from experience and going into next generations. But, of course, most powers who are operating carriers these days are already starting from a position of some experience. So that's going to affect what they're building, what they're designing, and what they want to utilize. And also, there's the fact that it's often easier to make the case for what you have than what you want. Now, let me explain that one. If I go to the Treasury and go, in the UK it's the Treasury, or if in America, basically it's Congress, and I go, this is what I have, I'd like a slightly improved version on what I have, so I know it's going to work. Therefore, it's very safe you giving me the money. That is an easy argument to make. If I go to Treasury and go, I want to do something radically different, that's a difficult argument to make. Now, historically, people have gone, well, there's HMS Warrior, there's HMS Dreadnought, so you have two British examples. Go, they were radically different. And they go, well, they're not. Warrior, the technology that goes into it has been included in all sorts of different places. And there's also the French building the Gloire. That's the argument for that. Dreadnought. Again, as I've talked about before, the design is included in the armoured cruisers. There's all sorts of various options going through, and they're basically using the guns that they were planning on using on Lord Nelson's and already used on a previous class to an extent. It is the greatest leap forward done with the most conservative steps possible. These things were not radical evolutions they went to the Treasury with. They also had the advantage that they're going, well, look, we're in a tech race in terms of battleship design with all these different countries. This is the next evolution. Italy's going there, America's heading in that direction. We can't afford to be last. This is another Warrior moment. So, that is something you have in that period to point to. But you have to realise the conservatism in them, the building on the experience and the operation already achieved. And this is the point when we're going for carrier design. What are we building on in terms of operation? What are we looking for? And again, I return to the quote from Sir Caspar John. And please note, I'm still hunting for a similar quote from an American admiral, and a similar quote from a French admiral, and a similar quote from other admirals. And when I find them, I will quite happily use them interchangeably. But I can't. I was tempted to send a challenge to a US admiral who I actually know in passing, who's just had command of a carrier for task group, and basically asking them to write their own version of this and publicise it in a speech so I could quote it. But I thought that would be manipulating history just a little bit too much. Just to get the quote. So I decided not to do that. And I don't know if we had the sort of relationship where I can do that, but we have exchanged a few emails over the years, and they're very nice, and very good, and a very interesting person, very interesting student of history. Which is why we ended up chatting, because we met at a conference. So this is what I go with, okay? If you can find those, which I have not managed to find, I'd be very happy to see them. And that would be a really nice Christmas present to have, barring 773 subscribers suddenly appearing on my channel before midnight tonight. I don't think in the next 5 hours I'm going to achieve that, but you never know. That's the winner bet with my aunt. I'll explain that when I get to the Shameless book plug. So this is an RAF station operating 60 to 80 single or small twin-engined aircraft. Add the fuel, stores, firefighting equipment, and so on which go with it. It always interests me, that one, because if we consider the current Queen Elizabeth class, they technically have space under normal maintenance conditions for 24 aircraft in the hangar. You can technically put another 44 on the deck, and overall, if you're prepared to be slightly more tight with things, you can get a maximum of 72 aircraft aboard them. And that's standard for these days operations. This is why they give it a figure of usually 40 aircraft. Because usually they operate 2 squadrons of F-35s and an appropriate number of helicopters. So usually you'll probably see about 16 helicopters aboard and about 24 F-35s. So that's about 40. Probably they'd up it to 36 F-35s in a war scenario. That's the plan, sending aircraft out. And probably add on another about 8-ish helicopters. And we'll probably end up with an operational air group of roughly 60 aircraft. That's probably what they'd aim for in wartime. There's a reason for 60 to 80. There's a reason, as I've talked through, the operational experience and how that fed into things. That's how we come to the figure of needing 18 aircraft, is how we generate our, what we need to generate our combat air patrol, our constant combat air patrol. 18 aircraft is what we use to generate a ready strike. 18 aircraft, that's where we come with that figure from. That comes from operational experience. That's where this number actually comes from. It's operational experience, and it's also operational experience which puts the ceiling on aircraft carriers of roughly 96 aircraft. You can fudge around with it, you can maybe push it up to 100, but if you try to go much over 90, and honestly much over, and definitely over 100, you are going to run into issues which every Navy which has tried has had, where you just reach the point at which there is too much complication going on for the humans, and even all the systems you put in, everything, it becomes too complicated to deal with. Now, often when talking this about, I sort of point out this is the limitation of aircraft carriers in terms of sailing ships at sea, because of their size. If you were, let's say, a starship, you might organize your air group into separate wings. Each wing had their own hangar, hangar area and space, and you could therefore get multiples of that going on, but that would be each wing would be coordinating that many aircraft and sustaining that many aircraft, and they could be their own separate entities pretty much. Because the problem you have when you're dealing with 100 aircraft in terms of the operational experience of Mortimer is the sheer amount of aircraft which need maintenance at this point, the sheer amount of things you have to be testing, the sheer amount of... It's all the scale up of the problems and the confinedness of the space and the fact that you have so many different people going around doing the things. It's humans being humans, bumping into other humans, trying to do human things. That's literally the problem. A couple of batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns, ammunition and control gear. Yeah, you need some air defense. A carrier's primary threat is always going to be air attack. Now you have to work out what is your air defense and what is appropriate. Myself, whilst I do agree that fragments on deck, FOD, is a massive danger to aircraft and can do more damage to aircraft than enemy weapons in some cases, because of the way it gets sucked into engines, you really sort of have to think through, why do we not have these things on a carrier? Why do we not have things like C-Scepter missiles or short-range missiles and close-in weapon systems? And honestly, the answer normally is someone decided to save some money. Usually it's based on the idea of what level of threat do we actually facing. And also there's the idea that maybe, it justifies having an extra escort perhaps in some navies. When you're arguing with the Treasury, we can't put, because of FOD, we can't put these things on on the carrier itself, so the carrier's going to need another ship to defend it, so we have to make sure we have that ship. And let's be honest, under those circumstances, an extra ship with missiles on it as part of the defensive force versus the missiles on the carrier itself probably is more useful. Probably. A minor battersea power station. That understates in so many ways the sheer power that aircraft carriers have to bring to operate. They not just have to sustain themselves as a ship moving and sustain their crew, they also have to sustain all the systems which support their operations. And this is just growing more and more as time goes on. A big radio transmitting and receiving station. Yeah. There's aircraft carriers are support ships. They're there to support aviation. They're there to provide what we tend to call organic aviation to task groups, to navies. And organic aviation means it's their own. They're not dependent upon any others. They're not dependent on communications. It's with them. It's guaranteed. It's there. As long as you need aircraft, you're going to need that. Now, there's an interesting discussion to be had about missiles. I've often talked about how aircraft in many ways are artillery as far as strikes, etc. are concerned, and they basically, the reason the carrier wins out against a battleship is not because they are a better fighting ship, it's because their artillery is longer ranged. And there's also the advantage that they can be reloaded far more easily. Aircraft carriers can be rearmed, reloaded far more easily than ships at sea can. I know there's this whole discussion about VLS reloading at sea, but there's going to be a video tomorrow coming out on Christmas Day with me and Sal Makilango talking about this, and we talk about logistics of it. And the fact is, the reality of reloading VLS cells at sea, you have to remember the supply ship has to be designed to take more than they actually do, and they really aren't designed to take a lot because they take up a lot of space. And B, they first have to remove the cells from the escort, crane them up and take them aboard the supply ship, and then they have to load the cells into the vessel. And yes, you can do this in good weather when it's okay, when things are, but it's far more difficult to reload those cells than it is to have a supply ship pull up alongside a carrier and offload all the missiles and all the bombs it needs for its aircraft to operate. So the thing is, whilst missiles are a continuation of that paradigm, they are also a current generation artillery. They are far smaller and not as reusable as the ones we can put on the carrier. So I think myself, when people said, okay, well, our escort's going to take over from the carriers, and I go, for some nations they might, but that's going to be a degrading of capability. For most nations who operate carriers, the reason they operate carriers is because they need that heavier strike. They need that persistent strike. They need that persistent capability. And they found it's an operational requirement. And therefore, supplying and sustaining that is far more cheaply done and far more efficiently done through an aircraft carrier. Which is the issue. It's far more efficiently done through the aircraft carrier. It really is. Now, if we go to the next one, the radar communications and other ancillaries of an RAF fighter sector controller. That's true. Again, as I think I started off before I got into the full details of the supporting argument, that the whole reason a carrier exists to support and act as a sort of a support asset, because that they already need radios and communications gear, which is one of the reasons why it makes sense to have the admiral and the flagship aboard them, the commanders and the flagships off aboard them, because all the information's already got to flow into the carrier, so you're not adding much more strain onto it. You are duplicating some systems and enhancing some systems, but it's not. You're already going to have the facilities for those systems anyway, and it's actually easier to add more of those systems onto it than add those systems on in the first place. And also what you're doing is that's facilitating another thing from the carrier, because the carrier is the organic air power. It's air for the air, aircraft for the air defense, it's aircraft for offense, it's aircraft for ASW, it's aircraft for airborne early warning, it's all those things. And the command and control facilities through them, well, they're pretty darn useful as well. They really are. Because you've got to coordinate those aircraft assets anyway, along with all the ships in the system, the ships in your force, and what other forces you've got there. This was the big thing about Albion and Bulwark for the Royal Navy, and also for quite a few of the LPDs in the US Navy. They are command ships. What's often forgotten about a lot of these amphibious warfare assets, as well as the carriers, is they have humongous banks of radios and flag systems and command spaces, so that they can command and coordinate forces not just at sea but ashore, in the air, everything. Because today's warfare is integrated. Today's warfare is seeking to use how do I put this? The minimum force to have the maximum impact. And often you achieve the minimum force by having an interoperable force of blending capabilities. Not by just going, well, I have one system and this is a super system. You're going to be talking about dozens of systems being operated. And this is one of the fun things we do get into, especially with news media, and quite a lot of discussion you get in terms of what I call immediate history, or first telling of history when you've got news. They tend to all focus in on the things they can visually see, because that's what they're told about, and they'll tend to be focusing on the visually flashy systems, because that's what will get clicks, that's what will sell newspapers, that's what will get people to watch the television screen. And they won't discuss all the systems behind them that are integrated into that to bring that to effect. So you get people going, this new weapon system is going to change the world. And a lot of people who actually work in that world going, it's going to have an impact, you're not wrong, but changing the world, no, because it's going to slot into this and this gap, which we're already to an extent using it for. It's going to replace these systems, but then it's going to be integrating with those systems and those systems. So that's not really revolutionary. And they look sort of confused. But that's the same with any area. The good example I always use, and I know Drac does this as well, we use a similar line on this one, which is fun because, yeah, it's the joy of being friends. Go for an area which you have specific knowledge. If you are a farmer, look at what news says about farming. If you are a doctor, look at what news says about medicine. If you are an IT whiz kid, look at what the news tends to write about computers. If you sit there and go, well, this is a very interesting first draft read of something, and they haven't understand this, then just remember that's the same for pretty much everything. Because journalists these days, there aren't enough of them for all the stories going around. B, the turnaround time they're given is absolutely minimal. And C, and this is the most important thing, most newspaper and news organizations do not have time to fund deep specialists in subjects, so the journalists themselves don't have time to become deep specialists in those topics. If you consider, it used to be in the UK, the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, they all had naval reporters, journalists whose literal job was to go to sea with the Royal Navy and see exercises and see what was going on with the Navy. And they might churn out 24 articles a year about the Navy. That would be it, maybe. But they were specialists in it. A good example of that is Ludovic Kennedy. And he was an ex-naval officer. He was also a very good journalist. Those people don't exist anymore. There is even an argument as to whether they exist in the trade magazines anymore, which are often the areas where the journalists go to for getting information and are just paraphrasing what they read in those magazines. Why am I getting into this discussion when I'm talking about operational experience of aircraft carriers? Well, the problem is now with that is you have to constantly deal with, when you are defining the experience you're drawing from your carrier, whether you're drawing from maybe a popular perception or perhaps misconception of a particular piece of history, or whether you're drawing from the actual history. That's a real problem, because people might go, classic example is the Falklands War. Okay? The Falklands War, there are multiple issues. The big one is airborne early warning and the lack of it. So really, you would expect AEW to be a defining factor of Royal Navy aircraft carrier procurement, a defining factor of the Royal Navy's philosophy towards carriers. Yet, when you look at the policies which have gone around it, you will realise that the more important thing that went around it was the image of the Harrier from the Falklands War and how great the Harrier did. And the trouble is, the Harrier did do well in the Falklands War, so it's not wrong. It's just that imagery covers up the imagery of the issue. And then there's all sorts of strange discussions about satellite comms and interference with radars, and you sit there and go, well, yes, that did happen, but the bigger reason for that not happening was the Harriers, which did do a good job, couldn't be positioned in time because there was no airborne early warning to position them in the right place to stop the strikes getting through, or even have a chance to stop the strikes getting through. Because the strikes are going to just hug the nap of the Earth and come up. And that's because, and I hope that I'm not spoiling too many people's ideas, the Earth is a globe. It is. Otherwise, the whole hugging close to the Earth and keeping as low altitude as you could would offer you no advantage in closing on an enemy task group, because you're hiding below the horizon as long as you can. And then there's the clutter effect as well of being on a low altitude as well. So that's the problem. What experience does a modern Navy draw on? And is it from World War II and the battles of Midway? Is that relevant experience to modern naval war? It can be. The weapons might have evolved, the weapons certainly changed, but the experience of how do you manage a conflict, how do you organize a sort of decisive battle, how do you bring that to a head? Yeah, Midway, Coral Sea. These battles still have information which is worthwhile looking at. But the fact is, there's also what carriers are used for in peacetime. You see, prior to World War II, we really didn't have much experience of carrier operations in peacetime, and basically the only navies which has had a large enough carrier force to be doing a lot of peacetime deterrence missions, various diplomacy operations, etc., with aircraft carriers, was the Royal Navy. Shock horror, it was. And mostly what they're getting up to is kind of piracy operations in the South China Sea, scaring the Italians in the Mediterranean occasionally, and occasionally scaring the French, winding up the Norwegians on at least 2 occasions, causing the Americans to have an absolute giggle attack because they had someone in a clown suit in one of their biplanes. All sorts of fun things. But it's not really a concerted effort. They are still working out how to use it for them. And then World War II happens. And suddenly aircraft carriers become the dominant force in the world. The dominant force, or the dominant, the dominant status symbol, the dominant must-have for nations with maritime strength and maritime problems. And that causes a further problem, because that means they are being seen as so powerful, they automatically slip into the capital ship, i.e. the battle cruiser more than the battleship role, actually, of the capital ship spectrum, because of how they operate in terms of going around the world and being visible. And then you have the Cold War. So we honestly had some very strange periods for naval diplomacy in terms of how it operates, because if you're doing naval diplomacy in a Cold War scenario, well, any wrong move can automatically lead to nuclear war, and everyone is 100% sure of that. So you become very cautious. Sensibly so. If that is the risk you're playing with, you should be cautious. You need to be. But it also starts to focus in operational experience on the North Atlantic, on the Northern Reaches, on focusing into the Soviet Union. And a lot of the rest of the world stuff is put to one side. And whilst other powers are still there and still percolating and still using aircraft carriers, a lot of what they do with them is not really widely discussed outside of them. The Indians are, for example, very, very successful when it comes to deterrence. Now, I have to admit, I haven't included in the Indian development program in the last section of this video, but there's a reason I've not. It's because it honestly deserves its own video, and it actually fits quite nicely in the year of leadership, because there are a couple of very cool admirals for the Indian Navy, although I have to make sure I'm spelling names right before I put them on the year of leadership. So I'm going to show you at the end a bit of the year of leadership plan, but it's not all completed in there. And that's partially because some of the people, I am checking the spelling of their names. Quite literally. Before I put it out there, I am double, triple, quadruple checking the spelling of their names. But there have been a couple of Indian admirals involved in their carrier development program who have done an absolutely spectacular job of selling the carrier not as a power projection tool in terms of hard power, in terms of military fighting power, although they do bring that up, but in terms of its peacetime role, its conventional deterrence role. And this is something which is always interesting to factor in, because people often go, oh, conventional deterrence, that's something new. It's not. Conventional deterrence has been around a lot longer than nuclear deterrence. In fact, the strategic deterrent and nuclear deterrent has slotted into the role which, honestly, battle fleets used to play at one point. Having the battle fleet, the mobilizing the battle fleet, was the deterrent symbol. That was the conventional deterrent methodology. Nowadays, when you're dealing with the fact that we have war often happening on many levels, in a grey zone as well as a fighting zone, etc., and we have the possibility of conflict well below absolute war between nuclear powers, you have to have both a balance of conventional deterrence and strategic deterrence in order to be effective. Because if you've got only nuclear deterrence and they're attacking you below the threshold at which you would be prepared to use nuclear power, you can't stop it. Or alternatively, you're left with a scenario of, they've attacked our ships. We have no other choice. We must now blow them to kingdom come. Or they're stopping our ships from operating, our merchant ships from operating. Or they're cutting our cables. What do? Well, we only have nuclear deterrence, so we must threaten to nuke them if they carry on doing it. And if they still do it again, then we either have to nuke them or suffer it. That kind of sounds a little bit silly, doesn't it? Now, the nukes are about deterring other people's nukes and deterring that and biological weapons and chemical weapons and those sort of attacks. That's what they are. They're for a strategic deterrent. Carriers, especially with their strike capability and the range of propulsion, and carrier battle groups, and also aircraft in general, etc., can be part of a conventional deterrent strategy. Often conventional deterrence is based around having something very high-tech and capable. HMS Warrior is a good example of conventional deterrence. They don't use those two specific words when they're describing a build, but go and look at their reasoning for building, and you will soon see, if you're looking at it, that sounds a lot like the arguments for conventional deterrence. And it's the same with HMS Dreadnought. Jackie Fisher, his idea was you had the most powerful, technologically capable vessel in the world. You made war obsolete because you'd make it so violent, so dangerous, no one would fight it. He's the most militant peace lover known to mankind. And I can actually get behind and agree with him on that one. There's a fair number of admirals like that, others like that. And there's an argument that some of Tillman's arguments, although he is such a terrible person in so many ways, please do not get this as in any way, shape or form as an endorsement of Tillman. Some of his arguments behind these battleships were just that. If we build the most powerful asset we could possibly build, that puts a ceiling on all this and tells people, do you want to fight this? You don't want to fight this. No one wants to fight this, so let's not have this fight. Conventional deterrence is all about managing the stuff below the strategic level, below the existential threats to national survival level. That's what we're talking about. And believe it or not, there are things at all sorts of levels. There's police are part of that, because they are policing, and those people, they are usually how you manage threats from non-government organizations, i.e. terrorism, etc. That's how you deter that. That's why police patrolling, police on the beat, police walking around town, etc. The visible deterrence of crime, that is a conventional deterrence. It's the same with ships. So, shameless book plug. Seems an appropriate point to get to it. Shameless book plug. So what's this all about? Well, this is me basically plugging my book, shamelessly. There are going to be more books out soon. March 2025. There's going to be another book. There will be another book. I will get it ready by then. He says, looking around the house, crossing fingers, touching wood, going, "You will not do more than this to me." But the trouble is, I'm an academic, I'm a historian, and I'm a public-facing naval historian. I'm entirely funded by all of you, and I love that. That's how I fund my research. It's entirely thanks to you, so I don't get told what to do by grants or anything like that. But the trouble is, my ability to teach in universities is always based on how many books have I sold. That's what gets me invited to teach. So, as I like going and doing teaching in universities, I like being able to teach in universities. Believe it or not, there is a lot of fun teaching history in universities, because usually you have students who are there who are willing to learn and interested in the topic, and you can really explore stuff, and they'll go off and do research, and you can have really cool conversations and really interesting ideas put forward. But that's all based on how many books I sell. So, if someone else is going to advertise it, I plug it myself. I do. And this is what we've got coming over Christmas. And I did promise also to say at this point to explain the bet. Yes, there's a small bet going on between my mother and her twin sister. It's the family bets, and the family bets of my family, there are certain rules. One, they're not for cash value. They're never for a cash. I think this one is, if I get to this year, it's if I get to 15,000 subscribers by Christmas, then my mum gets a spa day paid for by my aunt. And if I don't, my aunt, my mum bakes some cakes and things, I think, for my aunt. And yeah, so it's a bit of fun. But the trouble is, for the last few years in a row, my aunt keeps managing to set it just far enough out of the way that she wins. I'm 700 and something, 773 or 70, yeah, what's it, 70, 773, yeah, 773 subscribers from that. So if anyone does know some people who watch my channel, enjoyed it, and haven't subscribed, please do get them to subscribe by midnight tonight. Basically, it's going to be 23:59 hours UK time. I'd just like my mom to win the bet. Anyway, back into this. So, for the Russians, it starts off quite late. They have a lot of issues going on with their idea of carriers. For starters, a lot of the naval reforms that were happening prior to and during World War II were heavily associated with Stalin. And part of the Khrushchev's de-Stalinification of the Soviet Union takes place after Stalin dies. How do I put this? It revolves around, we must not go down this route. We must make a virtue of the routes we're going down. And they get caught in the trap which a lot of powers, rising powers do, and secondary powers do, kind of like the French with the June Occult. They get so obsessed with pushing down their way to show off how they are right and everyone else is wrong, that they end up pushing themselves to the point at which they've got nothing really to build from. And then they have to start up again from scratch. And this was the Soviet Union starting up from scratch. It starts off with a helicopter carrier, Moskva, which were terrible. Honestly, they are some of the most unruly sea vessels you would never want to go on in your life. They are awful in so many ways, and operating them was honestly a nightmare. But they did give experience. They gave experience, and the Soviet Union developed from that. They went, okay, we need something bigger. We also realise we want something which gives us an air defence option. That's what we want from these carriers. We want command and control. We want air defence. But honestly, we're not looking at the aircraft to provide a strike asset. We've got large missiles. We prefer to expend a large number of missiles than we do aircraft in a strike. And the whole point of these this carriers, and even the Kuznetsov here, the Kievs and the Kuznetsovs, is that their primary strike asset is their missiles. Their aircraft are a sort of secondary strike asset. They are primarily about air defense and heavy air defense, if they can, especially in the Kuznetsov. And that's one of the reasons why they go with the Stobar variant. And partially it's because they want to stand out on their own. They want to look different. And they do look visually very different. But also because if you want to rapidly launch aircraft, not having to reset the catapult does make it quicker. If you consider the Queen Elizabeth class for the Royal Navy, their one advantage over a Nimitz class, and it's one very small advantage, so please, please, don't think I'm saying the Queen Elizabeth class are better than this Nimitz class. They are a better suit for Britain's needs, I'd argue, than Nimitz would have been, because sustaining and supporting a Nimitz would have bankrupted the Royal Navy on its current level of funding, and would be almost too much for what the Royal Navy needs to do with its aircraft carriers at the moment. What it might need to do in the future, that's a different matter and a different thing, but we'll leave that to one side. And we're getting into the Royal Navy later on this. But the one thing the Queen Elizabeth can do that is a sort of their one-party piece versus a Nimitz is if they want to launch the same amount of aircraft, they can launch them quicker, more quickly, than the Nimitz can, because they don't need to reset catapults. That's their one advantage in those sort of metrics. And it's the same with the Stobar ships. They have this advantage. This is why India and to an extent China, if you're looking at carriers as defensive assets, as assets for sea control within your own primary region, as part of your own security for your own regional sphere, honestly, it makes sense. Because the barrier system recovery does allow you to recover aircraft more heavily. Now, it also does more damage and requires you to build aircraft more heavily, which is one of the reasons why you can't take off with a similar strike load as you could from a shore base if you were the same aircraft. But it is useful. And it's how the Soviets developed their technology. They developed it straight up through operation and experience. Every level is an incremental improvement over the previous. Incremental improvement. And there's even differentials in the Kievs between the different ships. There's differentials planned in the Kuznetsovs. The Tbilisis were going to be even more improved versions of the Kuznetsovs, but they required infrastructure investment and all sorts of things to actually make them work, so yeah. That's the reality, though. It's a very methodical approach, and that's normally what you have when you're developing aviation. And what was the Soviet Union developing aviation for? Primarily as a defensive means, to defend the bastions. The bastions were these critical areas of water where they wanted to keep their ballistic missile submarines safe, and they wanted to keep their own home territory safe and prevent other powers being able to use those waters against them, and use the strategic mobility of the sea against them by manoeuvring into those waters. They weren't looking at these as offensive tools. I think it's only once you get to the Tbilisi class, which were the unbuilt ones, that you're starting to look for an actual offensive carrier. A carrier which is supposed to be able to go on offensive operations and possibly go and cause problems in the Indian Ocean, cause trouble in the South Atlantic, or those things operationally. Because up to that point, honestly, the Soviets were happy to leave that to their cruisers and their submarines. That's what they had those ships for, to cause trouble. From the Svelda class onwards, a large chunk of the Soviet cruiser build is about building ships that are going to cause trouble in far distant parts of the world that NATO powers are going to have to send significant forces to go and deal with, which means those forces are not going to be available for the critical battles. Basically, the idea is, if I have a cruiser operating down in X along with submarines, you have to send a carrier battle group to go and fight it and sink it. And that's one more carrier battle group, less than you would have had to fight up in the North Atlantic or fight in the Pacific. And that's important to me, because if I can reduce you by a carrier battle group with only losing one cruiser, that is a worthwhile exchange in that critical battle. Because anything which makes those odds more in my favour is useful. I might even stand a chance of winning that critical battle if I draw off enough. Then we have Britain and its experience. Now, many people have asked me, why is it that the Royal Navy kept to Stoffel? Why did they keep to Stoffel? Well, partially it's selling it to the Treasury. It really is selling it to the Treasury. Part of it's the interoperability with the Royal Air Force. Part of it, as I've discussed before, is political discussions with the Royal Air Force and decisions of, we don't want to fight, but if we go for this variant of the F-35, that's going to be a direct challenge in terms of the Treasury's view of it, not in anyone else's view, but in terms of Treasury's view of it, to you retaining the Eurofighter and Tempest program, what will become the Tempest program at this juncture. And you have to remember, these things are political judgments made over decades. There's a really interesting phrase goes around a lot about this sort of experience time when we talk about Royal Navy experience, is, oh, Britain had a 10-year gap. Well, they didn't really actually have a 10-year gap. We had a 10-year gap in carrier strike, not in carrier operation. Because we had HMS Illustrious in commission until 2014. And Queen Elizabeth was at a key junction in her career in construction in 2014 and was commissioned in 2017. There's HMS Ocean, which is around till 2018. And whilst it is arguable Ocean is not a carrier, it's an LPH, and Illustrious was being operated as an LPH, that's landing platform helicopter, for that time, those are still operating vessels conducting existing to primarily support air operations at sea. And Britain spends a lot of time, Libya is a good example, they try and replicate carrier strike by having Apaches based off HMS Ocean and having strike aircraft launch from the UK, fly all the way across Europe, drop their bombs, and then have to fly home. It was all very, very expensive, but they spent all that, and it's a similar case for all the years until the F-35s came into operation and were actually available to operate from the carriers. So realistically, what happened? Well, this is the point when usually I have to explain that people, when they're saying, oh, you had a carrier gap so you don't know what you're doing, it's actually more stupid than that. It's not that you're wrong. And, it's the classic case of someone said, oh, the Britons didn't operate carriers for 10 years. And I go, well, you're wrong on that one. But you're wrong because it was actually more stupid than that. Not because you're wrong because they were operating carriers strike. It's you're wrong because they were actually operating the carriers, having the people doing pretty much the role, trying to replicate the role in the aggregate of other systems. And realistically, all they did was, with all the decisions they made about the Royal Navy carrier program, Queen Elizabeth class, etc., was cost themselves money by spending probably the price it would cost to build more than 3 Queen Elizabeth class. To build the 2 they did, because they delayed the construction, and delayed the ordering of F-35s and delayed the procurement numbers of F-35s. But otherwise, they've still spent all the money they were going to spend and actually have spent a lot more money. So actually, what they did was they did something which was supposed to save them money and supposed to be a really smart decision, but actually turned out to be really stupid, cost them a lot more money, and has forever made them a bit of a point of laughter. So that's the point. This is why it's not me being patriotic at this point. It's which some people seem to accuse me of when I say no, but it wasn't that we didn't have carriers for 10 years. It's more stupid than that. That's the reality. It's more stupid. Now, why does this experience matter? Well, if you consider some of the conversations I had with the recent SCSR coming up and all the things going into that, there are a lot of people who are using this experience from those 10 years, and some are trying to go, well, we operated without it for 10 years, so actually maybe we don't need it at all. And then you go, well, actually, look at the lessons of those 10 years. We spent 10 years trying to replicate it. We spent 10 years doing operations where we were basically trying to make it happen. The whole time. And for a while, our method of replicating it so we could do it was to actually invite the US Marine Corps to provide the aircraft off the carrier. Which shows you that the gap was not in carrier operations, the gap was in carrier strike because we were delaying the F-35 by. Lesson of this, people don't sadly learn their history. Because we can go back to World War II and look at the lesson of Royal Navy fighter procurement and all those things. Basically, the moment the Royal Navy weren't going to get there, they decided to pause fighter construction in 1939 or 1940, thanks to the various people who were making the case for it. They should have immediately gone to the Americans and ordered whatever they had on the shelf. Because if you can't build in the UK at that point, that's the only option. You only have a carrier power who builds carrier aircraft that you have a remotely friendly relationship with. I suppose they could have gone to Japan and bought Zeros. That would have been an interesting one. But no, they needed to basically go to someone they could go, cash and carry, we need to buy that equipment. I'm now thinking what the Zeros would have been like in the Mediterranean operating from the Illustrious class. I don't think it would have been that great. They are a bit light for that job, but they would have also been very fast and nimble, so could have been interesting over Norway. But that's a completely different subject. The point is, the experience matters in this case, and the experience builds up, and sort of in what it's like what the Soviets experience is, that we have built a better version of what we already operated because we knew what we were operating. And because this continues the experience, continues to enlarge. And it suits the British way of war. Now, you have to remember, at certain points, there are all sorts of ideas put into the consideration of this point. There was even points where they're sort of going, well, we're probably going to replace Albion and Bulwark and Ocean with a pair of LHDs, which will also have ski ramps, or 2 or 3 LHDs, which also have ski ramps, and so we'll be able to operate the same aircraft from our strike carriers, from our aircraft carriers, as we can from our LHDs, which will give us 4 to 5 decks we can operate F-35s from, 4 to 5 decks we can operate the helicopters from, and it integrates. And for a smaller power, like Britain, that makes a lot of sense. That suddenly is very advantageous because it means, well, yeah, but if there's a problem with the carrier, the aircraft can still operate from the LHD. If problems from the LHD, they can still operate from the carrier, and that makes sense when you're a smaller power, i.e., a medium power or a global power, as Britain is. Medium power tends to be divided into regional and global. If you're a global power, you're trying to affect the world globally and reach globally. Usually, that's because you have some sort of commercial, maritime, or technological or other interests, which mean you have to operate on a global scale. And if you have that capability and you're going to do that, well, it makes sense to have assets which can do interoperability. However, of course, there's the current MSS program, and that's not going to happen now. And this is the big lesson of experience, and this is the big lesson of operation. You can go down, you can get yourself into issues when you are basing your procurement based on this is a projected model of what we're going to have, especially longer term, because governments tend to make decisions and change their minds. When you're ordering a carrier, when you're ordering an aircraft carrier, you're also looking at ordering the air group, you're looking at the supply ships, you're looking at the escorts, you're ordering the whole force. You're not just ordering a carrier on its own. It's not in its own lovely bubble and sitting there independent. It's part of a whole system of systems you are going to be procuring. And the problem comes when you make changes to the system you're procuring around it, because you have procured this, the centerpiece of your system, based on what you were going to be procuring around it. And if you then don't bring in the stuff you're going to be procuring around it, it can start to look, well, why do we have that? What's it doing? And it still is the linchpin of your operations because that's what you've decided and structured your force around it. But the things which enable it to be the linchpin of your force, your operations, haven't been procured. So this is the other thing you have to think about when you're procuring an aircraft carrier, if you want to have one, is what are the systems you're going to get around it, and what are they likely to be? What do you want it to be? What are they likely to be? And are you going to get them? And you should make sure you get them, because if you don't get all the systems, the whole family of systems you need to build, that's when you run into trouble. Now, the example I often give to my students in that, and this shows you what some of them are in terms of their generation, especially in master students, I usually give The Incredibles as the example. It's a family cartoon movie from 2004. It's got some great lines in it. But they're a family of superheroes. And the example I tend to give is, if you consider the whole system you've got, if your aircraft carrier is Mr. Incredible, fantastic on his own. But really, if he hasn't got the rest of the family around him, he's nowhere near as good as he can be. And when you've got the whole family around him, when you've got all them doing their different components, his son, daughter, the baby, and of course his wife, who's just, well, very stretchy. Very, very stretchy. You have to watch the movie to understand. Then they are really something spectacular. They are far greater than the sum of their parts when they are together. And it's the same with the systems you build around an aircraft carrier. And Britain currently is providing a great example of how not to do this. Okay? They're providing a great example of that. There are a number of things not being properly done. And where they have procured parts of the system of systems, or some of the components of systems, and they haven't procured others. And they've made short-term decisions for whatever reason, and that's going to cause problems long-term. It will do. Because as often is the case, a decision which is made with a view to the next 6 weeks, or 6 months, tends to come back and, bite you in the next 6 years, or over the next 16 years. And then we have the Chinese, who are another force who are building for the future. And excuse me, I'm just going to, it's the bow. It's sticking off. I need to fix that. I know it's weird, but there was just some part of me which just didn't like that bow being cut off. It just didn't like it. And, well, the Chinese are doing similar to what the Soviets did. They are building incrementally. They are improving. They are operating and developing and understanding and accelerating ahead. They're doing a very methodical approach to their carrier development program. And again, I would argue it's about conventional deterrence. It's about them securing the first island chain, perhaps even the second island chain. It's about them trying to secure that defensive depth, because rather like the Great Wall of China, there are limitations to what defenses to how you can build your fortifications. As lovely as the Great Wall is, it was penetrated on a few occasions. It's more about, like Hadrian's Wall and Antonine Wall was about, it's more about cutting down the exit points and the access points and making sure you can actually try and contain an enemy attack than actually preventing it. And it has to end when it gets to the sea. And if you're going to try and have defensive depth to protect people or to prevent others from interfering in your home nation state, or being able to damage things in your home nation state, you need to be able to project power out around the sea. And the trouble with things like the first island chain and the fortifications you can build on islands tend to be horrendously exposed. Unless they have a fleet going around and supporting them, they can quickly get overrun. They can quickly get overwhelmed. That was the big problem for the Japanese. They built these defenses in World War II to defend their island, to defend themselves and buy time with Unchained. But the trouble is, once the fleet is no more, once the fleet has had its aviation gutted, has had its carriers sunk, and has been as damaged as it is, those islands are untenable, because the whole point about the island defense was it could buy time for your fleet to turn up and pin your enemy fleet in a position where you know they are. So whilst they're there trying to surround and attack and prosecute, you could come from a different angle and attack from whichever way you liked and cause them damage. You might even be able to get a surprise attack and wipe them out. That's the idea of an island defense strategy. Holding an island just for the sake and is just basically going, right then, we're going to sacrifice these people to buy us time. Because by its definition, an island can be surrounded. An island can be cut off from supplies. An island can be besieged, or rather blockaded, and then defenestrated. It can be. And the Chinese realize this. The Chinese have a long history of deep thought about strategic matters. And whilst will say I don't always agree with their conclusions, I do respect their methodology. But the reality is, they've looked at the situation and gone, well, you know what, there are lots of new systems which might offer advantages. There are lots of things we can put on the table, like our ballistic missiles, etc. Anti-ship ballistic missiles. But realistically, we're going to need carriers as well to be able to do this. And the problem with anti-ship ballistic missiles is they have a very similar launch profile to the ballistic missile system they're based off. And because of the directions and the number we might have to launch to successfully attack a carrier battle group, it could look very much like we're launching a full strategic strike. And then that depends on, is the President of the United States, who you're launching those missiles at, because presumably you're in a war with them, because otherwise I can't see any other reason for why you would launch such weapons, are they going to wait around to find out if those ballistic missiles are anti-ship variety, or the anti-US city variety, before they launch their own? Well, that's a big question to ask. So if you don't want to use that, well, you've got to have naval power projection of a more conventional kind. Especially in defense purposes, carriers are this. Now, what's interesting to me is the first two carriers are STOBAR. The first two carriers are STOBAR. Short takeoff, barrier assisted recovery. But the next one, the Fujian, that's going to be Catabar. That's going to be catapult assisted takeoff and barrier assisted recovery. And that's an interesting one for sure. It's an interesting capability to be pushing through. It works out. It does make sense, because the Chinese, the other issue they're dealing with is the fact that their maritime trade in their energy supply is entirely dependent on what I would consider an absolutely beautiful constellation, when you look at them from night, of tankers running from the Gulf to China. There is a constant flow of tankers running between the two, empty and full, running along, moving vast quantities of, let's be honest, energy resources. That and the other resources which they're dependent on to keep their economy going, their manufacturing economy going, coming from outside of China, means that for them, the maritime sphere is a vital one. Maritime trade is vital. Maritime infrastructure is vital. Control of infrastructure and prevention of others disputing your control of that infrastructure, that is critical. Making sure your supplies can flow. I wouldn't be surprised if very soon the Chinese change their opinions slightly on freedom of the seas, because, although they might not, or they might become very cynical, it might become freedom of seas when it's an issue which affects the movement that they support, and freedom of a very different view when it's affecting movement of supplies and things they don't support, which would not be the first country to follow that route. Either way, they need something to project their naval power around, and the moment they started operating task groups in the Indian Ocean and started pushing task groups further afield, it meant that the odds on them getting a Catabar carrier for a full-on power projection capability, a full-on organic air projection capability, became a matter of months rather than years or decades. It became a scenario where this is going to happen. And that's what we've seen happen. And they are developing a full air group. And it's interesting that, look, it's going to be probably a full hybrid air group. And again, that's going to be based on the experience they developed. And they've recently launched what is classified as a drone carrier, sort of an LHD, with some capabilities of launching larger drones and things. And the experience of all that is going to build into their carrier operations. It really is. Although it's not the world's first drone carrier. I know I've said this in many videos, but I do need to explain this sometimes because people, especially the news, keep saying this is the world's first drone carrier about the Turkish ship or about the Chinese vessel, whatever one's just launched. They go, this is the world's first drone carrier. And you go, well, when you're saying about something else a few weeks ago, they're all wrong. It's HMS Argus, which carried drones in 1939. They were part of the target. They were air defense training drones, Queen Bee drone system. But actually, what's interesting is the Royal Navy does look at the time at the idea of if they can weaponize them. I think they decide against it for various reasons in World War II. But it's a really interesting point of history if you start having drones, as in Tiger Moths, etc., loaded, or other aircraft adapted to task, loaded with explosives and being remote controlled to fly into targets from about 1940 onwards. How that would have affected World War II and affected carrier development is a really interesting thing, because would you end up with carriers going to sea with squadrons of these drones aboard that other aircraft would direct? It's a really interesting thing to think about, but it didn't happen, and we have history as it is. And we have USS Enterprise. Now, why do I have this to signify the American experience? Because honestly, this is what Enterprise was. Enterprise was about learning what you needed to do to operate the world's most cost-effective strategic conventional deterrence platform you can build. Now, one of the things we often get into with aircraft carriers, people going, well, wouldn't it be better to build smaller aircraft carriers than bigger ones? And you go, so what's the idea? Well, I want to build, instead of building two 60,000-ton carriers, let's build three 40,000-ton carriers. Then you sit there and go, well, the engines are going to cost pretty much the same for those two designs. They're not going to differ much, so that cost is going to stay the same. So you're going to have more actually cost in engines. The command and control systems are all going to be pretty much the same cost, so again you can have more of that. So that's going to put the costs up. You're going to need to generate now the free crews, the senior officers and things for the free crews, rather than two crews. Which, whilst you'll have lower overall numbers, you'll have more senior rates because you need the experience on the ship for its operation. So that's going to you're going to have to think that through and how you're doing that. And there's the whole operating of aircraft and efficiency of aircraft, because believe it or not, it gets more efficient the more aircraft you operate up to a certain point. Because the impact of an aircraft being down, the likelihood of you not carrying the spares, goes down proportional to how many aircraft you have. Because you're going to have more engineers, more fitters aboard, more personnel, and more aircraft to draw from. So instead of you having a problem which you go, well, that's a minor problem, we can push that to keep aircraft operating because we really need to. You can deal with it as a minor problem because you have enough aircraft spare. You can carry on. If your pool of aircraft, let's say, is 36 aircraft instead of 36, and in terms of fixed wing aircraft, and let's say they're all fixed 36 F-35s. Well, if one aircraft goes down, you've still got 35 to operate with. And the two groups of 18, if you've ever heard me divide them for cap, etc., the example given is you've got 4 in the air, 4 on alert, 4 on plus 15, and 4 in sort of other condition, down sort of plus 30 or longer, and 2 spare airframes. Well, your cap has to go and engage a target. You launch the alert ones. You put the plus 15 up to alert. You put the 30s up to plus 15. Cap that has engaged targets returns. They come land. They get taken down. They're they're in the aircraft now, and said, oh, one of them's damaged. Okay, that one goes into repair. One of the spare airframes comes out. That slots in. That allows you to keep up those 4 aircraft and that cycle. If you have 36, you have 2 of those. So 1 aircraft goes down. You've still got 3 spare aircraft. You've got 24. You've got a lot less. You've got 18. You're down to 2. Your spare aircraft is down to 2 aircraft. It's 2 spare aircraft. 1's down. You're down to 1. So if you want to sustain operations for longer, if you want to be able to do a longer-term fighting plan, if you want to be able to do more than the initial strike, more than just an airborne, more than just combat air patrol, the more aircraft you have, the more easy it is for you to sustain it. So therefore, the more effective your air group becomes. For the Americans, it's about status, and it's about effectiveness of operations. Now, also, these carriers are huge. They are massive targets. But they are the centerpieces of powerful strike groups, which include all sorts of ships and submarines and supply vessels, again, when properly supplied. And this is the trouble for the Americans, in that, to an extent, whilst the Royal Navy is currently the cautionary tale, the Americans are not far off it. The Americans have their own debates going on. There is a constant debate you often see about teeth versus tail in armed forces. And usually that means, well, there's too many logistics supply organisations and not enough fighting men, because what we need are fighters. And you go, yes, you do. But a fighter who's run out of ammunition and doesn't have food and doesn't have water is pretty useless. And basically, the tail is proportional to how far and how far away you want to fight, and how long a distance you want to fight on. And again, for the Americans, I would argue they have kept since the Enterprise. Realistically, they have just kept building a more efficient Enterprise, because it fits into all their doctrines now. Their doctrines are written around having carriers which have this capability, which have this range of operation, have this spread of firepower, have this viability. And so they are continuing on a system which works. It's what I tend to call the enterprising carrier doctrine. The problem for the Americans, I would argue, is that these vessels, as beautiful and capable as they are, last so long in service that they've produced such a rate of construction that it's limited down your options to the fact you have a single source supplier. And this is where lots of other complications start to come in. And this is why the operational experience of operating LHDs and LHAs, that's landing ship helicopter docks and landing ship helicopter assault, or a helicopter attack occasionally, some people have seen it referred to, are building up to quite a comprehensive overall picture for the US Navy in terms of its naval operations. Again, though, to my mind, the capabilities of their amphibious forces structure, rather than replacing their carriers, have served to emphasize the need of their carriers, because there is the point at which, when this is not enough, the only thing that will do is that. When an LHD, when one of their amphibious task groups turns up, and if that's not enough to deal with a problem, because that's got such a range of capabilities, then the only thing which is going to be enough capabilities is going to be that turning up with its battle group. And that's a big symbol of status. That's a big symbol of peace and of deterrence. And this was the reason I had the Phoenix Squadron back here, and I was talking, wanted to bring about this at this point. That's a classic example we often use in terms of peacetime deterrence by a carrier. The carrier gets within range, it launches its buccaneers, they do a very long-range pass over a critical piece of territory between, I think it's Honduras and Guatemala, and they make the point. Don't do this. Don't do this. You do this, we'll get involved, and we will massacre you. You don't want to do this. Go home. Call it a lovely exercise. Don't do it. We're in range now. And the thing is, you could have done that with a long-range bomber. You could have done that with all sorts of things. But the point is, a long-range bomber turns up, hits, goes away. A carrier is something which is coming to you, and it's bringing all that power with you. You see that power, you know there's something hefty coming your way. It's about making you think twice. And for the Americans, the deterrence power of their carriers is they are such overwhelming power. They are more powerful in some cases than some nations' whole air forces, that realistically those nations have to think twice. They have to think about it. And that saves lives. That saves money. Because it's far cheaper to deter war than to fight it. It's far cheaper, it's far nicer to not have to bury people who have had to serve in war. And it doesn't matter what the war is, or peace time. These things are very capable forces, but they're also very complicated and very risky. You are playing with a lot of power, you are playing with a lot of capabilities, you're playing with a lot of systems which are sometimes going into very dangerous areas where people are going to be on high alert. Things can go wrong very easily. And that's in peacetime. When you've got a war going on, it can get even worse. I'd love to say blue on blues are something new, but they're not. They've been around for an awful long time. Because war is like that. Because pressure on humans is like that. And if people are scanning constantly for threats, when something pops up they don't expect, it can look immediately like a threat, and they will react. This leads us, though, to the currently most interesting procurement project of the lot, and that's the French. Now, I've said I'll do the Indians in another video, in a video in the era of leadership, and I will. So please accept my apologies, but they're not included because in many ways they deserve an entire video to themselves to discuss this through, because I would make references, and the trouble is most of the sources you will, if you go and find them for, are not written in English. And so most of my viewership won't find them that easily. And so it's far easier for me to do a whole video so I can point to the video and save it for them. But the pang. You see, France has this habit. They build one. One carrier only. But they build it as capable as they can possibly build within their political limits. The political limits of that was they couldn't use the Saint-Nazaire dock. They can now use the Saint-Nazaire dock. That's what appearing. Basically, there is part of me which argues that this is what they would, the French would really wanted Charles de Gaulle to be if they'd had access to the Saint-Nazaire dock, but because of politics they couldn't. And they're building a carrier which is going to be as capable as it possibly can. It's probably even going to be require them to actually increase the size of the Marine Nationale's aviation section to have enough aircraft for it. It's going to be a tremendous capability. One of the interesting things I heard some people say was, well, will the French procure F-35s as extra aircraft for it? And there is part of me which does think the F-35C would be an interesting addition to its air group, but I highly doubt it. The French will go for national pride and national status, because part of this reason for this carrier is national pride and status. Part of it is the needs of having a nation which is spread out around the globe, which has little islands all around the world, which are departments of France. Part of it, though, is the fact that the French like to have strategic autonomy. They like to believe it, to say they're independent. Now, yes, their carrier program, and especially with a carrier which is going to look like a, in this projection, looks like a Gerald R. Ford class knockoff. I'm sorry, it does. In this artistic impression, it does look like someone's basically done some French sweeping lines over a Gerald Ford class. I have no doubt this is not what it will look like, but that's what it looks like in this design. Because of this scenario, the French actually do integrate quite heavily, like the Royal Navy do, into the American carrier program. The Royal Navy integration is usually using some of their training areas, etc., to go and train and work up the carrier battle group, because the Americans have all sorts of systems set up. Although, interesting enough, we might be actually setting up some of those systems this side of Atlantic as well to support NATO forces and even American forces when operating this side of the Atlantic, so they can go do training to the same level they can do as training off the coast of America. Which would be a really interesting thing for that to happen. A really interesting thing to happen. Because a lot of these capabilities, a lot of carrier capabilities, only come about because of a lot of training. And because of a lot of refits and a lot of work to keep those carriers at high condition. Because they're operating in salt water all the time. If you consider, because of how close I am to the sea with my new house, there are so many things which I read, especially like light things, etc., going, well, you might want this lovely metal light fitting. You shouldn't have this lovely metal light fitting, because if you're within a certain distance of the coast, which I am, we cannot guarantee this light fitting for more than a year. Okay. And that's living on land within a distance of the coast. The moment you're operating at sea all the time, doing all the things you need to do for carrier operations, going through all the systems and evolutions and events you need to do and carrier operations, you're putting even more strain on the vessel. This is why we normally say we have 3 or 4. We operate in multiples. The Americans tend to operate in multiples of roughly 4, which is why once you add in sort of the British and the French carriers, you get to 14. And yeah, you can maintain roughly the number of carriers you need around the world at all times. So it's roughly 3 to 4 of the British and the French, counting as forward basing, I suppose, to an extent. So it works out for your operational capabilities to be able to keep these carrier groups and these battle groups present in places around the world where they need to be, so they can respond to crises. But to do all that requires constant training and constant wear on the carrier, which is why they don't have to go in for refits for years. Because you basically have to rip out all the electronics and reinstall them. And as anyone who's ever been through a house rewiring will tell you, it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of holes, and a lot of things you didn't realize you need to be done will need to be done. Well, let's go back to this lovely description right at the beginning. And imagine what rewiring something which is a combination of an RAF air station, a couple of batteries of heavy guns, a power station, a radio transmitting and receiving station, and a radar communications and fighter control sector system, plus the housing accommodations for all the personnel aboard. Imagine what rewiring all of that's like. Doesn't matter how many people you chuck at it, there's a finite amount of space on the vessel to do it. And so this is something you have to, again, you learn with carriers. You can go, on paper, I can do this, and on paper, it will take this time. But then once you get in the reality of operating them, once you get in the reality of working them, as has happened in the Charles de Gaulle a couple of times, and other carriers a couple of times. You know, Prince of Wales, HMS Prince of Wales, sprung a leak because of a faulty seal. You can have issues. You can have things go wrong. You can do everything right and everything can still go wrong. So, there you go. That's the operations. The French carrier is going to be bigger than the Charles de Gaulle was, which I think is an advantage because it allows them to future-proof a bit more. One of the problems I think they've had with the Charles de Gaulle is the constrictions of building and dockyard they've built it in have meant that as aircraft sizes have increased and their maintenance needs have got more complicated, they've had issues pop up. But they're going to get over them. So I always finish my videos with a question, and I'm going to first off start by saying Happy Christmas Eve. I hope you're having a nice time. If I haven't completed the Beaver challenge on Twitch yet, where I'm trying to build a beaver pult, I'll probably be playing Timberborn on Twitch and answering naval history questions on Christmas Eve. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. You're happy. Don't go there. Questions, though? Well, what's the question I should finish this off with? The question of this entire video and this entire series is, so you want to build an aircraft carrier? Question, therefore, the only question you can build at the end is, do you want to build an aircraft carrier? And if so, how are you going to justify it? And what kind of carrier do you want? And what kind of operations do you want? And really think it through. What is best for you? Because you will never get me arguing that Katabar is not the finest system you want for developing the best range of aircraft, the heaviest aircraft you can possibly have. But that doesn't mean it's the best fit for all nations who want carriers. Because there is always politics, there's always other strategic issues which are going to affect that nation. It's a funny thing to say, sometimes the best isn't the best for you. But it's also true. Think about it. Even if I had the money, I would probably never buy a Rolls Royce. I'd always probably be Subaru and Volvo. Why? Because I have dogs that get muddy, and the moment I got anything like a Rolls Royce, I'd spend my entire time worrying, even if it wasn't, that it was going to get mucked up and how much the seat would cost to replace. Whereas a Volvo and a Subaru, usually you can clean those down in half a second. And literally, I've had a Subaru in the past which I could quite literally fire the hose inside and sluice out. It was wonderful. The fact that the gearbox went on it and would have cost more to replace than getting a new car was devastating to me. But that's the reality of it. I'm sure there are things you can think about for your own life where, well, yes, I could buy that. If I had all the money in the world, I could buy that, but I wouldn't. I'd buy this because this suits my life. This suits my needs more. It's the same with carriers. So I'd like you to think about that. And I'm going to finish off by showing you this, which is the Year of Leadership, as it's so far penned in. And it's so far penned in because, as I said, names, doing a check of things, but also I want to explain some of the stuff that's coming up in it. There's going to be some personal profiles in it. These are the Tuesday videos, remember. They're not the Thursday lives. They're not some of the premieres, which will be on Wednesdays. They're not the key ships, the key aircraft, and key leaders. These are the full deep dive. These are the Tuesday deep dive videos, the long patrols. And some are they're all sort of programmed in. Some of these are programmed in. Some aren't programmed in because I'm still deciding when I'll put them in. Some because I'm still getting their names right. But I'm basically going to follow a policy of most months it's going to be two people having deep dives on their careers, and it's easier to pick out the British admirals at the moment, but that's because I was fairly sure of the spelling of their names completely happily. And there was a whole argument in my computer system over the spelling of Farragut, and I'm hoping I've gone with the right one because I've gone with the F-A-R-R-A-G-U-T. But there's also one version of Microsoft Office trying to tell me it's F-A-R-R-U-G-U-T, which I don't think it is. But yeah, that's all sort of going on and working through all this to sort of put it together. And there are going to be a couple of them battle analysis where I'm going to look at the leaderships in the specific battles. There are also going to be operations put in there, specifically some operations which look at longer term operations and the requirements for leadership over a longer term operation. And I'm also considering including some politicians in there, but I do realise there's a naval history channel. And if I go too overt with the politicians, it will get very political, and I will get a lot of people who just want to score political points in the comments. And I like a comment, and as much as I enjoy interaction and realise that does drive the algorithm, I am in the business of trying to get people to love naval history and hopefully enjoy naval history and learn from naval history, not in the business of being a shock jock. So I'm a bit reticent about doing that. But there probably will be some politicians included. I will probably want to do some... maybe I'll do a whole video where I'll go through various naval secretaries for the US Navy and First Lords of the Admiralty for the First Lords of the Admiralty for the Royal Navy, and the trouble is the French ones like to change the title of their jobs so often, so I can't just do a video of this group, but I'll figure it out. I'll figure it through. And the Chinese one, finding information about them is difficult. For the Soviet Union, it's pretty much Sergei Gorshkov and people who have tried to be Sergei Gorshkov. But we'll think about this. Anyway, suggestions for both the Key Leader series and for these things are still taking in. As I said, I'm looking at spelling the names and I'm trying to get some battles sorted out. There's questions already appearing in Discord, which is there's this battle which takes place in Poland in the 13 Years' War, which I'd really like to do, but I can't find decent sources of it. Can anyone tell me where to go and look for decent sources? I like to set myself challenges. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and happy Christmas Eve, and Merry Christmas. Hope you have a wonderful time, and there's a live unboxing day, and there's a recorded video with Sam Macchiaro tomorrow on Christmas Day, because if you're anything like me in Britain, Christmas television is terrible for you. And I have literally done the recording with Sal, so I have something fun to watch on Christmas Day. Take care, everyone. Have fun.